Okay, so for these last 2 weeks, I've been kind of exploring custom effects. How can you kind of combine different things to create a custom effect, or find a desired look that you're seeking? So this week is going to be more of an overview. I'm not going to break down in detail everything I've been doing step by step. I'm more just going to kind of give an outline of the process and do kind of a step by step of each phase of the workflow. So because it's nothing really new, I'm just going to kind of roughly go over it. So we're going to be creating this kind of cyberpunk tech kind of thing where this building transitions into this kind of wireframe sort of, mesh view. So the first thing that you do is, the first thing that I did was basically, how do we figure out, so I'm going to just isolate this view here. I'm also going to hide this sky dome, so I don't select it. How do you figure out how to make this like transition where you have an object and it kind of cuts to nothing, right? It has this transition of it's like, disappears. So the way that we do that, what I mean by that is this effect right here, where it kind of cuts up, right? That. So how do you do that? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can do it in After Effects, which is very easy. But the problem with After Effects is that you can't really, it would be very difficult to incorporate that if your camera is moving, right? So the more we can do in the 3D space, the better it'll be. So we're going to do that. So I found a tool called the Polycut tool, and this is actually really helpful. So this is not available in Maya anymore, at least not in the toolbox, but it's still a thing. You can still find it. You just have to use a script. So script is really easy to find online. It's called Polycut. But basically the process of doing this is you would go into like orthographic view and then select the tool and then just click and drag anywhere, right? You can kind of, this is how it cuts. You just hold shift to snap, right? And then let go. And then we go back into our perspective. And then if we go in here and we press delete faces, it'll delete the faces where you cut it. And you can actually flip this around. Let me see if I can get this to, there we go. And then you can change the value on the y-axis. And you can animate that. So that's basically the first step, is kind of animating this, animating your mesh. And then after that, it's basically working in Mesh from here until you get to After Effects. So the first thing that you do is I created a couple different, like proxy meshes, I guess, like meshes that are going to help, that the same shape as your building but aren't the same geometry. And they basically are the building blocks for your mesh network. So you create that. I created this kind of thing. Oops, I'm still in the Polycut tool. So you create this, and then you have a couple different, instance objects for your mesh network. And you go in and you create some mesh networks. Let me pull those open. So the first one I did was this guy right here, this first one. So go to Animation, Mesh Editor. I'm going to unhide all these things. So the first one that we created was this. I'm going to turn these off. Wait a minute. Turn these off. There we go. First one that I created was kind of this sort of, how would you describe it? I think our mesh is hidden here. Where'd you go? Trails. This one. There we go. Okay. Just kind of get some of this more variation in terms of the cubes that are kind of going on, adding kind of like this techie noise kind of thing. So that was very simple. You just, have a base cube as your mesh. You create a network, and you go over here to the signal node, and you kind of, mess around with these settings, create some randomness of the size, and then, of course, distribute is set to, I think it's set to mesh and also random vertex, right? So you just get, a lot of randomness, you get some variation, and you kind of break your silhouette, which is, a little nice. So that's the first step, and then the next step would be to adding these kind of wires, these lines that kind of like go around the mesh. Which one is that? This one, right? And then this one too. So, and you basically just do, okay, so this was pretty cool. So what you can do here that I learned is really, really useful is if you go to polygon and just create like a cube or something, right? So I'm going to scale this up and I'm going to add some divisions to it. So I'm going to go over here, edit mesh, add divisions. I'm going to do something like 3. So we just got some geometry, right? So if you go in here and you select some edges, we're going to go down so it's easier to select. So just select a bunch of edges like this, right? And you can do this with any mesh. So just select some edges. You go up here. Maybe not these. Just add some variation. Loop around like this. And we're going to get back to our first selected edge. Okay. So you select some edges, and then you go to Modify, Convert, and press Polygon Edges to Curve. So hit that, and it's going to, because we have this isolated right now, it's not going to show us that. And we also don't have curves shown. But if it's basically going to create, I'm going to isolate these two things. It's basically going to create a curve based off those edges that you selected. And this is extremely useful for a couple reasons. One, you can set this to 1. You can set the degree to 1, so it's very linear, right? It's going to be exactly where those edges are. And 2, it's procedural, right? It's still reading the base mesh that you created those curves from, right? So you can scale this, and it's going to adjust accordingly. I think we have this. Oh, we have both of them scaled right now, so that's why that's going on. But so this is really, really useful, and this is what I used to create these lines going on here. Is I used another proxy mesh as the base for a mesh network, and from that proxy mesh, I created a bunch of these just very like rigid lines going on here around the mesh, and it kind of creates this. You know, if we go back to our video here, it basically creates these kind of cool trails that go on. Basically, you just add a curves node to that, and then animate that along the time. Let me pull this up just so we can kind of show you what's going on. Is it this one? It's this one. Curves. So you just add a curves node. You plug in all the curves to your input, and then you adjust these settings right here. And the nice thing about Mesh is it's pretty intuitive. So it's going to repeat the animation every time the curves, the object gets to the end of the curve. It's just going to start over. So you get a nice repeating kind of animation going along. It's very easy to work with. So, but after that, you basically just add trim. Sorry, not trim paths. I'm used to After Effects. You add trails in the mesh, in the network. So you just go here and then add trails, and then you're good. You basically just adjust those attributes until you get kind of a fall off in the length of the trail that you like, and then you move on to the next step. So the next step is kind of getting this volume kind of pass, right? These cubes that kind of like pass over the shape. And this is actually really simple. You'd basically, create your base mesh for your instance, right? For your network. So just create a cube, scale it down quite a bit, and then create a mesh network. So you would go in there, you would create your mesh network, and then you would set distribute to mesh and method to voxel. And you would really want to adjust the key settings here are the voxel settings, because as soon as you create this, it's going to go crazy. It's going to create a million, instances, and you don't really want that. It's just going to be too dense. So you want to go down and adjust these to fit the scale and kind of the size of the mesh that you have going on. So, but you would create that, and then from that, you would just create a signal node, and you would play around with these settings until you can kind of, adjust the noise and the noise scale to kind of get this, very kind of smooth, large pass-through of these cubes kind of thing. And then from there, it's basically just adding shaders, adding emissive, attributes to your standard surface, and then, render out from there. I will say that the one thing I did for this mesh here is for the shader, I went down to the emission, you add to the weight. Was it the weight? I think it was the weight and the color. But you basically, instead of adding an image, I created a fractal of, if I isolate this, of these kind of cube shapes that are, kind of have this animation play through it. And this was created in After Effects, so we'll jump over there into just a second. I'll show you how we did that. But you just import that as an image sequence. So you would export it out from wherever you get it and then import it as an image sequence, and you can use that as your, as a texture essentially. So that actually saves you a little bit of time. You don't have to, do a crazy mesh network or something to get that. It's, that's a kind of a cheat, but you can do it by hand. So that's how I did that. So at this point, you're ready to render. Render should be pretty quick. I had, about 3 to 4 second renders for this, so it's pretty efficient. And the next step, you're going to be doing a lot of compositing. So you would want to make sure you're exporting a lot of individual render passes, right? So export your emission as a separate pass for sure. Export diffuse and export your beauty pass as well. Something that helped me was actually exporting some of these things individually. So I would hide this mesh altogether for one pass, right? And just get kind of this thing going on. And then I would maybe isolate, let's see, this one for a pass, right? And I would render that out. And then I would bring that in After Effects as well. So consider what you would need, what you need in terms of layers and compositing, and then from there kind of decide which passes you need and render those out. So now we're going to jump to After Effects. I'm just going to do a quick overview of how I composited all of this together. So I'm going to open this up, and oops, that's something I want to do. I'm going to set this to halves just so we can get some quicker playback. So I imported all of my desired render passes. Kind of close this down. And I'm going to hide this, kind of work our way up. So you can see here that, yeah, there's just a bunch of different render layers on here. This one is a beauty pass on one of these. But you can see it's lacking a lot of the information. So the things that were more isolated objects, I render those out with alpha layers, as well as being their own thing, right? So with these kind of lines that go across, I think that's these. Yeah, those are their own render pass. So render those out, brought them in, and for a lot of these things, you basically just go in. There's a lot more you can do with this, but for the sake of time, you can just add a couple glows to it. One technique that I learned from Andrew Kramer, which is a great tip, is when you're doing glow, it's better to duplicate your glow a couple times in After Effects. And instead of using one glow to get the desired look, you use several. One of them being the core glow, right? The very high intensity glow that surrounds the base of what you're trying to illuminate. And then you have you basically radiate out from there. So you have a glow that's like for the core of the glow, and then you have one for how it radiates out. So kind of the fall off of that. And so what that does is just gives you a lot more control over each part of the glow instead of having to rely just on one effect. So remember, that's a good tip for me, is you can duplicate these and kind of get, you can kind of get a multi-layered effect going on very easily. So that's what I did with this. Let's see. And then let me show you how to do this real quick. So we're going to go New Composition, and we'll just type Fractal. So this is how I generated that fractal noise. I just created a solid. We'll set it to something very simple, black. We'll just call it Fractal. Fractal, hit OK. We're going to go to Effects, type in Fractal Noise, just drop that in, and then set this to whatever, something like Dynamic. Set it to Block, and there you go. You basically can just lower your complexity to something more like that. And then your brightness, you can adjust that as well. You can throw on, like, I don't know, levels. We'll just throw levels in there, and you can kind of adjust how the intensity you want, because you're basically using it as an emission map, right? So you want to make sure you're accounting for those, values. If you want it to be darker, right, you're going to want to push it more black. If you want it to be lighter, obviously more white. So, and then at that point, once you're ready, you have that, you would just go back into your fractal noise and keyframe this evolution, and it'll give you kind of a nice animation. Export that as image sequence, and then bring that into Maya, and it should work fine. So back to our pass here. Yeah, these are basically just separate render layers, like this one right here. It's just with the cubes, right, from that mesh network. Just added a little bit of glow to it. So that's basically all I'm doing here, just kind of compositing, very basic stuff. And then here, I basically just created let me pull this one up. That one we don't need. I didn't end up using that. Let me see, was it this one? Yeah, so this one was to kind of help the transition, because if you turn this off, it's not a very good transition between these things, right? It's not very realistic, and it's not very appealing. So to kind of cheat that a little bit, I just created a white solid and kind of cheated the 3D space there. Let me just isolate this so you can kind of see what's going on. I guess, oh, I can, okay. But it kind of just masked the shape of the cube. It's not actually a 3D space, but it gives the appearance of it. And then you can kind of keyframe that mask in order to give it a little bit more like pop, you know? And so that just kind of hides that seam a little bit, gives it a little bit, you know, more of a glow transition kind of thing going on. So you can get away with a little bit in After Effects, which is really nice. So that's how you did that. Of course, you just comp everything together. And it kind of, because I was trying to emulate an effect from a movie, which had kind of this lightning going on. So I just added some basic lightning to it, which you can do that with advanced lightning, obviously. And then the last thing you do, just kind of comp it together, is add a solid. You basically key out part of that solid, and then, you know, lower the opacity significantly, and then up the feather of the mask significantly as well. And then just kind of keyframe it to keyframe that opacity. Let me just show you what I'm talking about here. And then mask. So you just keyframe the opacity, so when the effect starts, it kind of like fades in, like it's glowing. You know, it just helps kind of bring everything together, kind of combine everything. So anyway, that's basically what the effect was. Very simple. You know, you're just applying a couple different principles to it. Don't underestimate the power of compositing. Very, very useful. It can get you, you know, a huge chunk of the way without having to do a lot in 3D. But I would also say, you know, there's a lot you can learn in 3D as well. This was a good week to kind of refresh myself on what I've been learning the past couple weeks. Unfortunately, I didn't get as much time as I'd like to spend on this effect, but I think it says something that I was able to do this very, very quickly with the tools that I've been learning in the past couple weeks. So yeah, very useful, and I would say definitely something we can apply later on in our workflow. And, you know, I encourage, you know, all you to, you know, challenge yourself and really look into these effects, see what you can do to play around with them. And yeah, so we're going to get into crowd simulation in the coming weeks. So until then, see you next time.